This time, I'd like to share some thoughts regarding the steel tariffs under the Trump administration. Currently, the Trump administration is planning to impose a flat 25% tariff on steel imports, not just targeting specific countries, but applying it to all imported steel products. This means Japan could also be affected, and there's a lot of attention in Japan on what this might mean for the Japanese steel industry. Additionally, people are also focusing on what would happen to the U.S. if a uniform 25% tariff is imposed. From a Japanese perspective, the primary concern is how it affects Japan, followed by how it impacts the U.S. Those are the main points of interest. As for the U.S., here's what's being said: imposing Trump's tariffs would indeed benefit the American steel industry. Since tariffs would make imported steel more expensive, domestically produced steel would become cheaper by comparison, which is an advantage. However, U.S. domestic production isn't sufficient to meet demand. As a result, the rising cost of imported steel would drive up overall costs. You might think, well, why not just increase domestic production in the U.S.? But that would take a considerable amount of time. So, for the time being, the burden of rising steel costs would fall on American consumers. Moreover, the Trump administration won't last forever. If the next administration lowers tariffs, the investments made by the U.S. steel industry could backfire and become a liability. This creates a dilemma for the American steel industry: should they invest more or not? On top of that, the Trump tariffs could lead to higher prices for final products in the U.S., increasing the burden on American citizens, which is a downside. Some argue that the disadvantages might outweigh the benefits for the steel industry, leading to evaluations that the costs could be too high. Considering this, the idea of a uniform 25% tariff might be a strategy to start negotiations, announcing it as a bold move to then negotiate individually with each country and secure favorable terms. How this plays out moving forward is something to watch closely. Now, let's talk about the impact on countries beyond the U.S. Which country does the U.S. currently import the most steel from? What kind of image do you, the viewers, have in mind? Many probably assume it's China, thinking that the Trump tariffs are ultimately aimed at targeting China. That's a common perception, right? However, here's the twist: the country with the largest share of steel exports to the U.S. is actually Canada, accounting for about a quarter of the total. So, what about China? I looked up some numbers online, and in 2018, China's share was around 2%. Back then, additional tariffs had already been imposed on Chinese steel, causing it to lose price competitiveness in the U.S. market. So, that 2% from 2018 has likely dropped even further by now. This is similar to what's happening with electric vehicles, EVs. The U.S. has already heavily restricted imports from China. But here's where it gets interesting. If tariffs on direct exports from China to the U.S. are extremely high, Chinese steel could be exported to countries like Mexico or Vietnam first, then shipped to the U.S. from there. Even factoring in the additional costs of routing through those countries, it could still be cheaper for the U.S. to buy, while China could bypass U.S. tariffs using this detour. By the way, this isn't just a theoretical idea, it's something that's actually been flagged as a problem. The U.S. has been imposing tariffs on Chinese steel for quite a while now, and there are established routes for it to enter via third countries. Speaking of Chinese steel, it's not like China produces some uniquely high-quality steel that only they can make. It's more about versatility, nothing particularly specialized, but there's strong global demand for that kind of general-purpose steel. China produces it at an incredibly low cost, thanks to its massive domestic supply capacity and fierce price-cutting competition, which translates to extreme cost efficiency. China's steel supply is so cheap and abundant that even if third countries buy it and resell it to the U.S., they can still turn a profit due to the huge price gap. So, while direct exports from China to the U.S. might only account for a tiny 2%, a lot of the steel entering the U.S. from other countries likely originates from China indirectly. This means the tariffs targeting China have become riddled with loopholes. This issue was already being highlighted during the Biden administration. While the Biden administration outwardly claimed to be cracking down hard, there were gaping holes in enforcement. For example, haven't NVIDIA GPUs been flowing into China in large quantities despite restrictions? There have been some crackdowns, but that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. Much more is likely slipping through. Similarly, during the Biden era, routes for Chinese steel to enter the U.S. indirectly, not directly, were already well established. Understanding this background sheds light on what Trump means by uniform tariffs. Previously, steel from China faced high tariffs, but if it came through Mexico, the tariffs were lower. Companies would export to Mexico first, then send it to the U.S. to avoid the high tariffs. But with a uniform tariff increase, it wouldn't matter whether it comes straight from China or via a third country, it'd face the same rate. That eliminates the advantage of using third country routes. If you export to Mexico first and then to the US, the added transportation and insurance costs make it more expensive than shipping directly, right? So, raising tariffs uniformly would effectively block these third country detours. Ultimately, if routing through another country no longer makes it cheaper, companies stop doing it. That's the point of uniform. The Trump administration wants to stop China's deflationary exports. Japan, on the other hand, can no longer compete with China on price for products of the same quality. It's shifted to selling high-quality goods that China can't produce. For those products, U.S. tariffs would only bring disadvantages. Even if the U.S. tries to produce them domestically, the equipment investment would take money and time. In the meantime, how do they bridge the gap? American companies needing those goods would have to buy them at higher prices due to tariffs, which is a pure loss. So, Japan's position should be, we're not helping China with their third country export detours. We're not part of that. If Japan can explain this clearly, it could argue that tariffs on Japan would only hurt the U.S., opening the door for negotiations. Other countries face the same situation. If they're seen as aiding China's tariff evasion, they get hit with tariffs too. It's like the U.S. is fed up with countries all over the world helping China dodge tariffs. Japan should say, we're not one of those countries, so please don't impose tariffs on our exports, it benefits the U.S. too. I'm sure the Japanese government is already working on this. If you only look at U.S. import stats, you'd think, China's just 2%, so Canada, the biggest exporter, will take the hit from Trump's tariffs, and China won't be affected much. But in reality, there's a ton of indirect Chinese steel coming in through third countries. Trump's trying to stop that, which is what China fears most right now. If third country exports get blocked too, China's domestic situation is dire. They've got way too much production capacity. There are so many steel companies in China that they can't sell it all domestically. This ties into why China's economy struggles despite having about 100 million relatively well-off people. People often focus on that number and say, with 100 million consumers, the economy should be fine, but that's not the issue. The real question is whether those 100 million can absorb the massive supply of goods and services from China's producers. It's a matter of balance. Imagine a village of 10 people with 100 convenience stores. Could they survive? Even one store wouldn't make it. It's obvious a village of 10 can't sustain an economy, but when you hear 100 million consumers, people overlook the supply side and assume it's enough. In China, though, there are so many companies producing far beyond what those 100 million can consume, not just in steel, but cars, real estate, everything. The proportion of genuine consumers is just too small. Think of China as a village of 10 people with multiple convenience stores. The steel industry is the same. If they can't sell abroad, most of them will collapse. If a village of 10 had 3 or 4 stores, they could only survive if tourists or outsiders were buying. China's economy works because it sells to the US and abroad. If the US cuts that off, most companies would go bankrupt. What I'm watching now is whether Trump is using this pressure to negotiate with China or not. If his goal is to completely shut out Chinese products, China's steel industry is as good as dead. But if he's applying pressure for another purpose, like telling Xi Jinping's regime to fully stop fentanyl exports to the US in exchange for market access, that's intriguing. If it's not a bargaining chip and he's just saying, you've been sneaking through third countries, and I'm done with it, then something massive will happen in China, no doubt. When I mentioned this to a left-wing activist, they said, no way. The Chinese Communist Party will make all Chinese people wealthy. It won't just be 100 million. Over 1 billion will start buying appliances and cars, and there won't be enough steel to meet domestic demand. Is that true, or just a delusion? That's for you, the viewers, to judge. That's all for this time. See you in the next video.